Good morning. This is Chair French, Chair of the Kansas Corporation Commission, convening the regular business meeting of the Kansas Corporation Commission for this Thursday, June 27th, joined by my colleagues, Commissioner Keither and Commissioner Keene. We apologize for the late start to the meeting, had some technical difficulties as happens from time to time, but we are all here now and ready to go. On today's agenda, we have our consent agenda with 23 items. We have 2 noticed orders, and we have 1 discussion item, a presentation from Evergy. So we will go ahead and begin with our business meeting. Commissioners, you've had the opportunity to review the consent agenda and the 23 items thereon. Let me ask at this time if you have any questions, beginning with Commissioner Keither.
Thank you. I do not.
And Commissioner Keene.
No questions for me either. I would move approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
We've got a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. Any further discussion of that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed, say no. The consent agenda is approved. We will now move to our 2 noticed orders. The first item on our agenda is a final order in docket number 24 CONS 3103 CUNI. This is on an application for unitization. I do understand that we've had a request by a commissioner to pull this item from today's agenda just for some additional review and consideration. So I am just going to go ahead and pull that off the agenda. We'll take it up at a future meeting, and we will move to our second noticed item. This is in docket number 24 TRAM 896 MIS. And this is a proposed order designating guidance document and approving staff's use of the Transportation Division's Uniform Penalty Assessment Table. And our presenter for this order is Mr. Assam Latif. Good morning, Assam.
Good morning, Commissioners. This order arises out of the Transportation Division's annual review of its motor carrier penalty assessments. The Transportation Division special investigators conduct compliance reviews on motor carriers domiciled in Kansas. And at the completion of those compliance reviews, motor carriers are provided with a list of violations that ranges from minor to major. Major violations result in civil penalties issued by the Commission, and these fines are aimed at improving the safety of motor carriers operating amongst the general public and enforcing motor carrier laws, rules, and regulations. Transportation staff annually reviews the civil fines issued to motor carriers through commission penalty orders and decides to add or remove violations or to adjust the severity of those penalties based on the feedback from our special investigators, trends in the industry, and the state of motor carrier safety in Kansas. And in recommending appropriate fines, staff looks at the size of the business and the gravity of the violation. After discussion with staff, this year there were no recommended changes from the fiscal year 2024 penalty assessment table. And this is noted in staff's R&R and reflected in the fiscal year 2025 penalty matrix, both of which are attached to this order. Staff believes that the fiscal year 2025 penalty matrix, which is submitted, is appropriate in that it reflects the current motor carrier industry context and the motor carrier safety regulations. With that, staff recommends approval of the order. I'm happy to take any questions, and also Jared Smith is also on the call.
All right, thank you, Hassan. Are there any questions on this item? And I will begin with Commissioner Keither.
No, I don't. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And Commissioner Keene.
No questions, just as comment. I may not have been the only one, but I know that I did suggest that this be placed on the noticed agenda instead of the consent agenda. And the main reason for doing so is, given the fact that it may be a no change situation for the most part, I think the consequence of what this entails and what this really means is significant. So I just thought that it ought to have a bit more visibility, I guess, and that's why I've asked you to do it. And I thought your representation of what the order contains was quite good. So thank you for that, Hassan.
Thank you.
I move approval of the order. Pardon me.
No, second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the proposed order regarding the penalty matrix. Is there any further discussion of that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, say no. The order is approved. Thank you, Hassan.
Thank you.
All right. Finally, we have come to our discussion item, and this is an update to the commission by Evergy Kansas regarding the status of its transportation electrification programs that were approved in docket number 21 EKME 320 TAR. And I don't know who exactly I'm turning it to, maybe Nick. Whoever wants to lead off here. I think you have a presentation. You should have the ability to share your screen. So I'll just turn it over to you all.
That's great. I will take the reins from you, Chair French. I appreciate it. Good morning, commissioners. Happy to be here to provide an update on our existing electric vehicle programs here at Evergy. My name is Nick Vorse, and I manage the electrification team. I'm going to hopefully start a screen share. So I'll have you please let me know if that
It's up.
works.
We can see it.
Excellent, excellent. So I think we'll do just a brief safety moment, as is tradition. Then I'll talk through some of the key points of our program, things that have happened over the last year, and after kind of giving everybody a refresher on what our program is. And then, as we did last year, we're going to talk about what we've termed some contemporary issues, things that we think are notable going on in our industry. And then we'll wrap up by talking a little bit, giving you a preview of what's going to be important to us over the next 12 or so months. On the safety moment front, it's summer. So we just wanted to draw a line under summer heat safety and kind of the pillars of being safe in the heat. And one is to, kind of avoid that intense heat as best you can, but also stay hydrated and stay informed. We're kind of going through a period here, I noticed, where it could be 95 one day and 85 the next. So it's kind of like storms can catch us unaware at times when they pop up. Heat can do the same when we get into a pattern like this. With that, we'll just talk a little bit about what's going on in the EV adoption world that, at least within our service territory. I've shown these charts before, but just as a review, on the left is kind of what's happened with respect to EV adoption in our service territory to date. That's that burnt orange color. And then the gray is the projection of the future. The bridge between is what we expect to transpire during this calendar year. So in short, we had, coming out of 2023, about 26,000 vehicles in our combined service territory, 15,000 of which were in our Kansas service territory. We'd been growing at about a 35-ish% a year clip. In other words, our EV population has been doubling every 2 years. If you watch the news, if you keep your fingers on the pulse of what's going on in the EV community, you have undoubtedly heard that things have slowed down. You see that, eagle eyes will notice that kind of the slope of that dashed line that represents what we expect to happen this year is a little flatter than it has been historically. They just released first quarter sales data, registration data, and it's increased 15% year over year. So for a lot of metrics, that's a notable number, right? Something's increased 15% year over year. But when you're accustomed to 35, 40% a year, that is, relatively speaking, a fairly pronounced slowdown. But as you can see, however, the expectation is that that slowdown is kind of a temporary phenomena, and that by the end of this decade, we'll be knocking on the door of 200,000 EVs in our service territory. On the right-hand side of this slide is what's happening with our Clean Charge Network, which is our network of public charging stations. Each of these traces represents 1 year beginning in 2021. That's the bottom trace. And of course, the partial trace at the top is what's happening this year. And these are the kilowatt hours dispensed from that network. And you can see pretty dramatic growth. We had about 60% year over year growth from 22 to 23. Thus far this year, we are on pace for about another 60% year over year growth. So we're actually right now outpacing the rate of EV adoption And we talked amongst ourselves about kind of what might be the drivers for that. And my personal opinion is that what we're seeing there is in no small part a reflection of people returning to the workplace, either in general or increasing the number of days per week that they are in the office and have access to workplace charging. Any questions on this slide? Okay.
No, I was going to ask what you thought the drivers were, so that's great. Anything else from commissioners or staff? Hearing nothing, I think you can go on.
Okay. This is an overview just to remind folks of what constitutes our transportation electrification program. We have a commercial rebate that helps offset the costs of non-utility entities who want to install charging for various use cases. You see those use cases lined up on the left-hand side of that chart, highway, public, and so on. And then the numbers kind of proceeding from left to right, we have maximums for the number of level 2 ports and DC fast charge units that are eligible for a rebate, and then a maximum dollar amount per site as well. And just a reminder, level 2 is the single phase. It's 240 volts at home. It could be 208 in the workplace, but it's a markedly slower rate of charging than DC fast charge. DC fast charge is 480 volts, 3-phase, and that is the type of charging that is predominantly used in a highway setting where people are engaged in long range travel and they want to stop for 15, 20, 25, 30 minutes and then get on their way. On the residential side, we have a rebate for folks who either own or lease an EV, and that rebate applies to the installation of a 240 volt, i.e. level 2 circuit in their home. Our rebate is agnostic to how that circuit is terminated, meaning we don't care if they terminate it with a hardwired charging station or if they just install a 240 volt plug-in that they then plug a charging station in or a charging cord in. That is of no concern to us. We are rebating the installation of that dedicated charging circuit. We have 2 levels of rebate, one for folks who are on TOU or willing to enroll in TOU. They are incentivized to do so by getting a higher rebate, $500. For folks who are not on a TOU, they get that $250 rebate. Lastly, we have time of use rates in our TE program. It created a rate that is dedicated to EV charging outside the home. We call that business EV rate, which is a 3-period time of use separately metered. We have a carve out for folks who provide transit service. So it's kind of similar, what's a TOU rate. So it's similar on that level, but it only has 2 periods because we designed it to kind of align with the charging patterns of like a Topeka Transit or a Wichita or a KCATA. And then we included, just for kind of completeness sake, they're not part of our TE program, but we also have at this point, a selection of residential rates that incentivize folks to move energy use, not the least of which being EV charging, off peak. Any questions about kind of what our existing transportation electrification program is before I talk about some results from this past year?
Are these programs all consistent across all 3 of your service territories, or are there some of these things available in some that aren't available in others, or is it completely consistent?
Yes, it's consistent across Kansas. If we compare Kansas to Missouri, there are some wrinkles. There's some slight differences. Conceptually, they're the same, but there's some slight differences in terms of eligibility.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I couldn't remember some of the details. The 2 things that you said that maybe I need to remind myself of where we landed was the piece about whether you had to install a charger or whether you could just install a 240 volt outlet. And for some reason in my mind, I thought we'd approved that you had to install a charger, but that may not have been right.
You have to have a charger in order to charge a car,
okay.
right? That charger can either be plugged in to like a NEMA 1450 outlet, which is what a lot of Tesla folks do, or it can be hardwired. So we don't that prescriptive as far as how that charger connects to the circuit.
Okay. And then, yeah, I couldn't remember as a result of the last rate case exactly where we landed on the different rate options, but what's on this slide is what's applicable in Kansas.
Yep, for
Okay,
sure.
great. Any other questions from commissioners or staff? Nobody's getting off mute real quick, so I think you can go on.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that residential rebate. And just a reminder, the purpose of this rebate is to encourage people to kind of transition to 240 volt charging, because when you do, you charge for 60, 90, 120 minutes a day rather than 8-10 hours a day, which is indicative of 120 volt charging. So from our perspective, your charging becomes more portable in time if it's happening, for an hour rather than 8 hours, right? We can move that hour around, and we'll talk about that later on. We are on pace to exceed our program goal for the total number of rebates provided in this 5-year period. That's kind of the top line result of where we are heading with the residential program, is that we're on pace to exceed. We also are observing that it's roughly 50-50 split between TOU and non-TOU, slightly overweighted to non-TOU customers who are taking that. That being said, Kansas Central customers in particular have access to kind of a greater level of analytics to help them make that decision as of this year. So we would like to think that, armed with kind of that greater level of knowledge, that we're going to see a swing more towards TOU enrollment. Any questions about the residential rebate?
I see here that you have that it's a precursor to managed charging. This is sort of the, what we have now, but maybe not tailored exactly to EVs. Maybe you're going to get into this, but what is kind of the timeline for looking at more nuanced managed charging programs?
Yeah, so the headline there is that we expect to file during the third quarter this year. We expect to make a filing that includes managed charging. Yep.
Okay, cool.
Any other questions?
Not from me, and I don't see any hands, and I don't see anybody going off mute. So I think continue.
I'm going to roll on to the commercial EV charging rebate. Year over year looks pretty good. Our applications have over doubled year over year. That being said, when you kind of look at the absolute value or the total level of participation, it's been pretty sluggish so far for the first couple of program years. And there's a number of reasons why we believe we're seeing that, and we include those under highlights, which in retrospect they don't feel like highlights to me. But anyway, firstly is that the federal government has created numerous grant programs related to charging. And with the exception of the National EV Infrastructure Program, which is installing charging stations along our major highway corridors that KDOT's running, with the exception of that program, the others are rolling out very slowly. And we believe that folks are kind of waiting to engage us until those federal programs become more real. Luckily, we have kind of marketed accordingly, and we're sitting on about 75-80% of our marketing budget. And we expect to really ramp that up kind of commensurate with these federal programs rolling out. So we are hopeful that we see a marked uptick in takers of our commercial EV charger rebate program. That being said, a couple other factors are that just this kind of genuine or general cooling sentiment towards EVs. It's reflective of EV adoption. I think that folks who jumped on, other utilities had these programs 2, 3, 4 years ago, and they were more popular than this one. And I think that a lot of the lessons learned from folks who jumped into that is that it's pretty difficult for that to be a profit center for them. They need to have kind of other drivers that justify them jumping into providing EV charging. So I think those lessons learned are kind of reflected in our program as well. That being said, we have a portion of our total budget, which you can see for the way this works is it's $10 million total between non-underserved and underserved. And I might say that when we say underserved in this context, what we mean is underserved with respect to EV charging. And there's a defined structure for that we worked out with Justin and staff. And like that's a defined definition for this filing. We spent or committed about 14% of our total 10 million budget, and about 55% of that budget allocation for underserved counties designated underserved, has been paid or committed.
Can you remind me if the underserved county definition, is it different for level 2 versus fast charge? What's the consideration of what type of infrastructure exists? Because well, I'm just going to give a personal example, and I drive an EV. I drive to Hutchinson a lot, and there's some of these larger Hutchinson, some other places farther out west that are that size of town. They've got some level 2 charging, but there's not much fast charge infrastructure in those areas. And is that considered in the definition of underserved, where they may not be underserved by level 2, but there's just absolutely no DC fast charge?
That's right. Our underserved definition is an either or situation.
Okay.
So we have a criteria for level 2 and we have a criteria for fast charge. And if the county triggers either one, then it's considered underserved with respect to EV charging.
Good. Great.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I think you can go on.
Okay. It kind of takes us from what's happened with our program to our contemporary issue discussion for this year. I would note that if you are following along on the PDF that I believe was provided yesterday, there's a couple of marketing slides that show kind of our tactics that were embedded earlier in the slide deck. I've moved them to the back, so they're here, but they're in the back. I put those in the appendix because I was a little worried about time. Contemporary issue number 1 is has to do with kind of the overall rate impacts of EV adoption.
Oh, Nick, I see that we have a hand from Justin Grady. I probably missed it. He was probably wanting to ask a question on that last slide.
Good morning, Justin Grady.
Hey, good morning, Nick. I was trying to get off mute. I was trying to raise my hand. It wasn't working. Thanks for recognizing me. Quick question for you, Nick, because, to be honest with you, I just don't recall everything that went into the negotiations for, non-underserved versus underserved. But, it's looking like, at least at this point, that the commercial rebates are much more successful in the underserved counties. And yet we've only got 15% of the budget slated for underserved counties. So, I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but I'm going to. So don't take it personal. What do we do if, in another couple of months, the underserved county bucket is empty, and yet the non-underserved budget, is still sort of struggling? Is that something, are you guys open to a discussion, maybe put something back before the commission to shift some of those budget dollars over into the underserved? I just any conversation around that or discussion that would be appropriate, I'd appreciate. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll all go on a walk down memory lane, and then Wendy Marine, who I believe is also on this call, can be our fact check. But the way we are structured with this program is that the total budget is $15 million. There's another $5 million that's out there that I haven't talked about, but that $5 million is only unlocked if we fill the underserved bucket. Okay, so this 10 million, another way of saying that is this 10 million is kind of all one thing. But 1.6 million out of this original 10 has to be spent in underserved counties before that last 5 is unlocked. Okay, so if we fill this 1.6 in underserved, we'll continue to fill rebate requests in underserved counties from that 8.4 because there's no wall in between those. We've given that impression from the way we have shown this on this slide. Does that make sense?
Okay, yep. All right. That's really helpful. Thanks for the clarification.
All right. Let's go forward here, talk a little bit about, there was a study from Synapse consultant firm about 4 or 5 years ago. And what they did at that time is they took a look back, and I think it was California, and they looked at the costs of serving EVs and the revenues that utilities are realizing by virtue of those EVs. And they said that the revenues outpace the cost to serve, which is great. It's a net benefit for all customers, right? Puts downward pressure on rates. And Evergy and several other utilities, kind of the way I put it, they really made hay out of that study, and that we cited it a lot. And I think if you go back to our 2021 filing, you probably see us cite that study as part of our narrative about, EVs being beneficial to all customers. Well, fast forward to last year, Synapse revisited that study, and they generalized that study, and they applied their study methodology to every state in the union. And the result is that for every state in the union, that original conclusion is true. Namely, until now, 2011 to 2021, in every state of the country, the revenues generated by EVs have outpaced the cost to serve those EVs. Moreover, the right-hand side of the slide, that kind of dot plot, each of those dots is a state. And what that shows is the more EVs you have in general, the more of a benefit it is to those states' customers. And then
So
I put
when
for
it-
reference. Yeah, go ahead.
When it says cumulative net rate impact, is that a net reduction in
Yeah,
revenue requirement?
yeah, right,
Okay.
right.
Okay,
That's
gotcha.
where they're going with that. Yep.
Yeah.
So that's important. We think that is an important part of the EV story. Nonetheless, it is a backward look, and history is all fine and good, but what about going forward? Well, going forward, one kind of, we think, important data point for us was put out last year by California's consumer advocate. And what California's consumer advocate did is they took a forward look, and they said, okay, based on the IOUs in California, kind of how much they're spending, EV adoption, like is it going to be a benefit to all customers in California? And the California consumer advocate, their study predicts that electrification is going to put downward pressure on residential rates for each California IOU. That said, there are 5 key model assumptions that this prediction hinges upon, and I think it's worthwhile to kind of talk through those. The first is distribution infrastructure expansion costs. Okay, that's largely inflation, so utility has very little ability to impact that. Utility infrastructure investment amount and location, absolutely. That's something that Evergy and other utilities can influence greatly. We want to make sure that we are getting smarter in the ways that we forecast and we operate the grid. We want to make sure that we are making the investments where those investments are needed to support local EV adoption. Load growth to electrification, it's got to grow as assumed in the study. I would argue that utilities don't have a ton of levers for that, or levers that move the needle materially, maybe I should say, in a more nuanced way. Existing utility programs will not be meaningfully expanded. So they said, okay, these California utilities are spending X on utility programs, and if they start spending 2X, then our math blows up. That's reasonable. It's also worth noting that California utilities spend 10x per customer on electrification than, compared to Kansas or Missouri. And we understand why, right? There's a host of reasons for that. Lastly, residential charging load shapes, right? If everybody charges on peak, then our math blows up. Something that utilities have, we've got levers for that. So I think that this is a really illustrative, useful study to show, one, the potential and the promise of EV adoption, but also to show kind of what utilities have to do to make sure that EV adoption is beneficial to all customers, not just EV drivers.
So I've got a
Questions?
question on one of those bullet points, the distribution infrastructure expansion costs. Given there has been some EV adoption in your territories, and I guess personally, I think I've noticed anecdotally that certain neighborhoods seem to be pockets of a lot of electric vehicles. And have you all noticed a need to have to upgrade certain feeders and substations feeding certain residential neighborhoods as a result of that? Or has it played out that the existing infrastructure you have in place was sort of oversized enough to handle that?
Yeah.
I guess, where are we coming down on replacing infrastructure versus existing infrastructure being able to handle pockets of EVs?
I would say that to date we have not seen that from a systemic basis. Have we popped a secondary transformer? Well, we've got tens of thousands of them. So yeah, I think that's happened, but not to a meaningful degree. Later on in this deck, we talk about I list at least some of the kind of more sophisticated analytical monitoring tools that we are standing up to stay on top of what you're talking about, to have more real-time knowledge of what's going on in the local distribution space, and increasing the sophistication of our forecasting tools as well, so that we can foresee and anticipate those neighborhoods, those circuits where we are likely to run into a problem within the next X years. At the same time, putting together product proposals that help shape load that also, decrease the probability that we're going to run into issues, or that take pressure off of those circuits and those transformers.
Okay, great. So at least so far, it's not something you're having to do, is to go out and rework any residential substations or feeders, or at least not substantially.
Nope.
Okay, that's good news.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Keither.
Yeah, well, how much to feed in, if you'll pardon the expression, feed into that last conversation, how much advance time would you need to address issues that would be cropping up in different specific areas? If you need to add to the load, to fix, address the load, how much advance time would you need so it doesn't become a problem?
I'm a little over my skis. I would say that nice to meet you, by the way.
Thank you.
Commissioner Keither. I don't think we've met before, but it depends on where the problem is, right? If it's at the lowest level, then you're talking about commodities, parts and pieces, if you will, that we have a lot of them on hand. If that problem kind of propagates to a higher level, to bigger, more sophisticated pieces of equipment, then, potentially like rebuilding entire circuits, things of that nature. That's a several months to a year plus situation. So it really depends on kind of how local that problem is, or how far it propagates back towards the substation.
Okay. Good. Thank you for that. Nice to meet you too.
Thank you.
Nick, Dwight Keene, we're going to all pick on you at one time here, all of a sudden.
Go for it, Commissioner Keene.
Good morning to you, and thank you for the presentation. I specialize in leading questions, so I'll start with this one here. Basically, refresh my recollection, Nick, who bears the costs for the general construction and installation of the EV infrastructure? How are those costs borne?
Yeah, there is a construct wherein the customer, we look at the utility side costs associated with serving a given site, and the customer gets, I'm going to call it in simple language, a credit for the amount of revenue that we believe that site is going to generate. And that revenue is compared to the utility costs of serving that site. And in some cases, they end up not bearing any costs if we expect, revenues to exceed the cost of running that new service. In other cases, it becomes a cost sharing situation.
And how are the costs? What is the cost sharing? How does that work?
Yeah, so let's say that it's going to cost Evergy $10,000 to run power to this new charging site, and we run it through our model, and we believe that the customer is going to, customer gets $5,000 worth of credit for the revenues that site's going to generate, then they are responsible for that other $5,000 of cost.
Okay, so it's pretty much I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Nick.
That's okay. I was just gonna say, so we end up going halvesies on it, right?
Okay, so it is in that sharing that you've just portrayed here. So the user is going to portray that, is going to bear that cost to the extent you have that revenue versus cost
Correct.
Workout. Okay, very good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions for this slide? Okay, we'll move on. This slide really builds off that last bullet, kind of talking more about load shaping and moving load around. And conceptually, what we're talking about is on the left-hand side of the slide, where we have this EV load that if it's all bunched up at 6 p.m., that's no good. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to move it around to fill times when the grid has more capacity. And we really, and I think we put this construct in front of y'all last year, but we've latched on to a construct that really defines, okay, if you're preparing your grid for EVs, kind of what categorically are the things that you need to do to create a grid that is, considered smart with respect to EVs, and you can see the different categories here. And what I'd like to do is just highlight what's happening at Evergy, or what has happened with Evergy, as we effort to make our grid more smart with respect to EVs. And you see all sorts of colors here, and kind of working right to left. The black are areas where we're not really active. We don't have a active plan in place for those line items. Green are things we are working on, or things that are in our relatively near-term future. You'll notice I bolded and italicized residential managed charging and fleet advisory services program, because those are the two components that we will plan to include in our filing later this summer. And then blue are all of the items that we have that are currently active within Evergy. So you can see that we have quite a lot of activity across the company, be it here in product where I live, or operations, analytics. This thing is, electrification touches the utility really stem to stern, and I think you see that kind of play out on this slide. Any questions here?
Nick, I don't know if it's a question for here necessarily, but one thing I've been thinking about is how dynamic some of this is. I mean, you want cars to be charging and using the grid in non-peak situations, and that seemed like a pretty simple concept in the past. I mean, I think even today it's, you want them to be charging between midnight and 6, or some other non-peak times. But I mean, it strikes me that there's a lot of dynamics at play that, I mean, first of all, that's different in different regions. You know, California has a lot of solar, and so they actually want people to be charging in the middle of the day. As SPP starts to add a lot of solar, I mean, I can see, you know, your incentives and timing of when you want people to be using the grid to change. Have you all thought about that you need to have sort of a program that's dynamic or able to adjust to sort of real-time grid conditions, or at least is able to adjust year to year based on a shifting resource mix or other factors?
Our proposal later this year will include both a passive and a dynamic piece to
Okay.
it. Yep.
That's fine.
And
A lot of my questions I feel like could just be wait and see.
yeah, well, and you know, by the way, your eagle eye. I mean, this here, it's an illustrative load
Mhm.
curve, but this is kind of a California load curve, right? Because this is a duck. Here's the duck curve, and California is trying to move their EV charging to. So conceptually, it fits our, you know, our conversation, but this is
Mhm.
more indicative of what's happening, of what
Yeah,
you
it's
just
just
described that's happening.
different hours of the day.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
Any other
Very good.
questions, comments?
Nothing from me, and I don't see anybody else raising their hand.
Yeah. Okay. So kind of the final rung down the rabbit hole here for today is kind of what's happening at Evergy with respect to AMI data. And what you see over this slide and next is more or less an inventory of how we are either already using or plan to use AMI data to help provide insights and to help us manage the grid both in real time and with our forecasting and long-term planning in this day and age of electrification. And the first three items that I've shaded green are the most apropos to this conversation, which is why I emphasize them. Currently, we have started to provide customers with feedback. We've disaggregated their usage on a month-to-month basis to show them kind of roughly how much of their energy use is going to different applications in their house. So really educating them on where their energy use lands, how it's distributed. Secondly is EV detection. We are running pretty sophisticated algorithms that with varying degrees of confidence are identifying residences where we are either highly, we believe there's a high probability that an EV lives there, or a maybe. We're doing that today to try to get our hands around where the EVs live in our service territory. The next level of that we intend to roll out by the end of the year is to follow up with a confirmation prompt, right? Like in a non-creepy way. We think an EV lives in your house. Hit yes
Commissioner
or no.
French, your demand spikes to 11 kilowatts at
Yeah, right.
12:05 a.m.
Yeah.
every
Yeah,
day.
right. Tell us about those 48 amps.
What are
Yeah.
you doing?
Mhm.
All right.
Yeah, so we're going to give customers an opportunity to just verify to us. And then lastly is, and I've alluded to it a couple of times, residential managed charging. AMI data is going to play a pivotal role in, as you will see, the residential managed charging that we are going to propose later this summer. The rest of this I won't itemize, but I will just highlight, you know, kind of it gets, especially on the second page, it gets markedly more kind of operations focused and very analytical. But we just wanted to you know, shine a light on how AMI is really coming to the forefront of how we are running our business and doing our planning in the grid space. Any questions before I kind of wrap up with a brief kind of overview of what's important to us over the next year? Okay. Priorities, next 12 months. as I mentioned, program marketing, we're ramping that up commensurate with the federal programs, hopefully to get commercial rebate uptake to accelerate. I've mentioned federal program supports. I've mentioned NEVI specifically. You can see kind of how we are supporting. We have a lot of customers who, sorry, I've been coughing since Memorial Day. We have a lot of customers who are pursuing federal money in some way, shape, or form. And we are supporting them in various ways. Most recently, last week, we had conversations with both Mark and I say WAMPO. We've talked to WAMPO. That wasn't last week. We talked to actually Flint Hills Metropolitan Planning Organization last week. So Mark, WAMPO, Flint Hills, these are all regional or metropolitan planning organizations that are putting together EV readiness plans. We are supporting them in various ways with just subject matter expertise, but also with local grid conditions to inform their decisions about where charging might make more and less sense. The new product filing, I probably mentioned 3 times. That's in front of us for the 3rd quarter this year. And then organizational preparedness kind of harkens back to the AMI discussion that we had, just really becoming more mature, becoming increasingly sophisticated in how we bake EV adoption into our various plans and programs, how we operate our business, in short. Any questions about kind of what's in front of us? Okay. Well, with that, I would pause one last time for general questions, and because otherwise we are finished.
Yes, Nick, I would have a general question. Dwight Keene again, please.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to mousetrap you here, but it's amazing that within the past week, McKinsey has released a survey that's entitled Mobility Consumer Pulse for 2024. Are you familiar with that? Have you seen that?
I've done a page flip on it. Well,
the reason I bring it up, this is a real contemporary issue, I think, for us, certainly as regulars. I would just very succinctly summarize some of the conclusions that this McKinsey report suggests. One is that approximately 1/2 of the EV owners, current EV owners, want to switch back to gas-powered vehicles. The trend line they showed for nationwide for EV sales, a little bit different than yours. Yours is a little more optimistic, I think, than theirs. They were showing that it was approximately 2% of total vehicle sales in 21. That was up to 8% in 23, but it's nosediving here in 24. That was nationwide. Another fact, the way that they threw out, which is incredibly eye-opening to me, was that the values for EVs just immediately driven off the lot. The depreciation is about 50% from the sales price versus a depreciation of approximately 6% for the internal combustion engine car. And I think the reasons they were listing for lagging sales in 2024, one was in some parts of the country, a really tough 2024 winter. The high initial costs of purchasing the vehicles, the availability of charging stations if you're doing cross-country trips. None of these are of any surprise to you, but in the face of that survey, we have another survey by AAA that I've found that showed that 2/3 of EV owners that their next purchase would not be an EV. Maybe a little more specific, and I'm going to be quiet, and then I'm going to ask you a question. One of the interesting things about going back to the McKinsey survey here is that the buyers were generally confined to those who were interested in a second car, lived in big cities, or had short commutes. That the sales was much more problematic for families, suburbanites, those living in rural areas, and older buyers, and that even the subsidies, rebates, and all could not overcome some of the skepticism about EVs. I guess I'm kind of looking at the other side of the coin here. I know I'm not trying to just if it weren't for this being a McKinsey report, I would say, what's the credibility of a report like this? But I think their credibility starting out is pretty good. I guess my question to you is this. It strikes me that looking at both sides of the coin, the prospective benefits, advantages that you see going forward, the prospective risks that you see going forward. My question is, if the trend that some of these developments that are discussed within this McKinsey survey and what they portend, if this was to continue, in your opinion, who's going to bear the risks and the costs, if you would, associated with, if it played out, a potential overbuild of underutilized EV infrastructure? And how do you go about planning for the downside?
Sorry.
A potential downside. I'm not forecasting anything. I'm just an observer. Okay.
Yeah. So keep me honest as far as answering your question, but there's a few things there that I'd like to unpack. One is that I wholeheartedly agree. After the passage of the signing of the IIJA, the Infrastructure Act, and the IRA, there was the pendulum veered solidly into kind of irrational exuberance with respect to EVs, as happens, right? This is not a phenomena that surprises any of us, that something swings far this way and then, okay, wait, stop, that's too far. And then eventually in the long term, it finds its right position. One of my fears sitting in the chair that I have is that somebody is going to buy a battery electric vehicle that says it can go 250 miles and they're going to take out of Topeka and try to go to Wichita when it's 0 degrees outside. And that's going to be a bad day for them if they expected that they wouldn't have to stop. And that's because the range is highly variable on a battery electric vehicle with respect to speed and temperature. I think you see folks get surprised by that. And that is part of the reason why you have folks that buy a battery electric vehicle and are like, man, this is not a good fit, which is why I preach dang near every day that we only want people buying battery electric vehicles where their use case fits what the cars can do today. And that is key to our education efforts here at Evergy. I say, mirroring some of what you said, as a second car, awesome. As a car that is going to live within a 100-mile radius of its home base, no brainer. You want to do more than that? It's a more nuanced conversation. It's definitely not a no. I've been a lot of places in my electric car. It's definitely not a no, but it's a more nuanced conversation. We don't want people to be surprised. What hasn't entered the conversation and what didn't in your description of McKinsey is the role of plug-in hybrid EVs, which solve all of that range anxiety and disappointment with range associated with an all battery electric vehicle. And we see this playing out in terms of the traditional automakers, the GMs, the Fords that are pivoting. They thought that they could maybe skip plug-in hybrids, jump straight to BEVs. That's why you saw Ford make the Ford Lightning, instead of kind of taking that incremental step of making a plug-in hybrid. What they're realizing now is that there's a huge appetite in America for plug-in hybrid vehicles, and they are reacting accordingly. And the number of plug-in hybrid vehicles and the capabilities thereof is going to increase fairly dramatically over the next few years. So plug-in hybrids, kind of like there's a contingency of people who are not happy with the idea of natural gas being a bridge fuel, right? Likewise, there's a contingency of people who aren't happy about plug-in hybrids being a bridge. But I would argue, as I sit here, in both cases, those are true and they are necessary in our country. From a grid management perspective, a plug-in hybrid today's plug-in hybrids charge at kW levels similar to all battery vehicles. So that doesn't change what I do at Evergy. It doesn't change the need for a managed charging program. It doesn't change the need for public charging infrastructure. In fact, you could argue that plug-in hybrids need it even more because they have relatively small all-electric ranges. So they're more likely to use it out and about than somebody who owns a battery electric vehicle that can go 250 miles, right? So hopefully, I'm stopped talking there because that was a lot. And you can let me know what didn't I discuss.
Well, it was very holistic and nuanced, and it's very helpful. I'm be very candid with you. I mean, because I've actually seen the survey before I saw it. I saw the report on it in the business news media, and there was a quote. They were quoting whoever was the person overseeing this, McKinsey, how stunned they were with the results that their survey brought about. But I think you point out a distinction with a difference, and that's this plug-in hybrid. I think that, as I say, your response was very holistic. It was very granular. It was very helpful. We don't have to look much beyond what at least I see in the business press. It's just the recent past. Here we have Fiskars in bankruptcy now. We have Rivian, Polestar, and Lucid. They're losing money right now at a rapid clip. Ford evidently claims, and this is a little more anecdotal than I would prefer, but as I understand it, they claim that they're losing about $100,000 on each EV vehicle. So I think their switch to probably plug-in hybrids is going to be more rapid than some of the others because they have to do some recoupment here. But no, I think you've been very helpful here, and I think what you're saying too is, in the case of a wider spread adoption of plug-in hybrids, the infrastructure risk attendant energy and operating the grid in our area is going to be commensurately reduced. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, I mean, I like to say it's an evolution, not a revolution, right? And the question that I get fairly often, Commissioner Keene, is, well, was the grid ready for all the cars to be electric? No, it's not. The grid is not ready for all cars to be electric. But that's not a reality. That's not a plausible scenario. The grid is ready for how many cars we have today. In 2030, the grid is going to be ready for how many cars we have in 2030, because there's people at Evergy and other utilities who wake up every day and go to work to ensure that it is, right? Evolution,
Sure.
Not a revolution.
Sure. Well, the whole thing's a work in process. That's progress, maybe process for sure. So
Sure.
I appreciate very much your indulgence in the question. I appreciate your response as well. Thank you, Nick.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Yes, I have one.
Go ahead, Commissioner Keither.
Thank you. The former politician in the room there, it is an election year. Do you foresee if there is a change in the White House, what kind of impact it could possibly have on funding and going forward with programs that you can put forward for the consumer?
This question sounds so fun that I would do well to not entertain it.
But it's out there.
Yeah, it is. I guess I would just note that the support for electric vehicles is embedded within the Inflation Reduction Act and the
Okay.
Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Mhm.
So I don't have visibility to the capability, much less the appetite of, for example, the GOP to deconstruct or to unwind those. I'd heard that there was some aspect of IRA funding that kind of made it somewhat protected from potential changes, because so many of these programs run to 2030, right?
Right.
But I would say more generally, I hesitate to speculate, Commissioner. I'm sorry.
Well, but there was a little bit there that placating, but it's got to be something you all are paying attention to, I'm sure. So I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but thank you.
Quite all right. Any other questions?
I'm looking for hands. I might just make one observation and have you respond if you have response. I had definitely seen the McKinsey report in the news media in the last week or two. And I guess my read of it is it's quite a bit more nuanced than sort of the sky is falling headlines. Actually, what it seemed to say to me basically tracked with what your presentation was earlier, which is, things are cooling a bit. People are unsure about EV adoption. Some people that have bought EVs, particularly non-Tesla buyers, have had a truly awful charging experience. And depending on what happens and whether there's better charging infrastructure available in the future, they could go the other direction. So I guess I don't know if you have any response to that. That was just kind of my read of it is, there's no secret that particularly for the non-Tesla crowd, the infrastructure is not making it a good experience. It will be interesting to see now that there seems to be this shift to open that Tesla infrastructure up to those other car types. Will that change things? As you start to see, federal dollars start to implement more charging stations, does that change things? Any additional thoughts you have on that, Nick?
Yeah, I would say that as these federal dollars, particularly NEVI, does its job, the charging landscape is going to change pretty dramatically. KDOT has approved, I don't know, the first half dozen or so sites for highway corridor charging stations, and they are on the cusp of approving their next round. So they are deploying those dollars. We're going to have far more highway corridor charging stations in Kansas, 2, 3, 4 years from now than we have today. I would double down on your comments related to Tesla. Tesla has opened up their network to Ford, Rivian. I charged alongside a Ford Lightning in Chicago 4 months ago. So it's a thing, it's happening. It's not every supercharger site, but it's most of them in our service territory, I can tell you, that have been opened up to other makes. That's a big deal, right? We have, I don't know, maybe 12 supercharger sites between downtown Kansas City and Denver. I think that's pretty indicative. So you open those up to Ford and other makes, that's a big deal.
Well, I don't believe I have any more questions. I got most of mine answered throughout the presentation. Does the commissioners have had questions? Staff, any questions? I don't see any hands. I don't see anybody jumping off mute. I think that's everything for us.
Real good. Well, I will just hand back to you then, Chair French.
Thank you.
Adjourn or to continue with your business or whatever's next.
Thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome.
If you all can stop the screen share, all we have to do is adjourn our meeting.
I'm terrible at this. Let's see. Here we go. There it is.
Perfect. All right. With that, we have come to the conclusion of all the business noticed on our agenda today. If there's nothing further to come before us, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
Got a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. We're adjourned. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.